What does it take to destroy a country? In the case of Nigeria, it took just one company, Shell. Shell arrived in Nigeria with the promise of developing the country, generating employment and income, and improving people's lives. But what happened was the complete opposite. It controlled the government and its armed forces, poisoned the population, polluted its waters and farmlands, destroying the livelihoods of millions of families. And when a group decided to fight to save themselves from the clutches of this infamous company, they met a tragic end. 80 Nigerians dead, 600 houses burned, and endless repression. This is the dark story of how Shell deceived and destroyed Nigeria. During World War I, Shell was the main supplier of fuel to the British Army and the sole supplier of aviation fuel. Shortly after the conflict ended, Shell became the world's largest oil company. But they were not satisfied and wanted to continue expanding their business. Large companies, when they need to grow and make more money, start by increasing their production, manufacturing more products, for example. But for major oil companies, it's not possible to simply manufacture more oil out of thin air. After all, it is a finite natural resource. They need to find new reserves. The problem is that the countries that own these reserves are not very willing to let foreign companies take over them. The way out is to find countries that have large oil reserves but are poor because they do not have enough resources to extract it. But besides being poor, it is also necessary that they are corrupt because negotiations become much easier that way. And Shell found a country that met all the requirements, Nigeria. In 1958, Shell began its operation in the African country with the promise that it would bring many foreign investments, jobs, income, and development to the country. However, it didn't take long for this partnership to turn into a real nightmare for the Nigerian people. At first glance, Shell's arrival in Nigeria seemed to be a great deal for the country, as it would be wonderful to have a company bringing investments and infrastructure to its nation, given its extreme poverty. But all of this would come at a high price, starting with the dependence that Nigeria began to have on Shell. This is because about 90% of the country's entire export is precisely oil, representing almost 40% of its entire economy. Additionally, 65% of all Nigerian government revenue comes from Shell's operations, which in itself poses a significant risk to the country's sovereignty, finding itself hostage to a single company. If Nigeria tried to change the agreement and regain control of its own oil, Shell could completely stop extraction and thus dismantle the entire country's economy, plunging it into a huge economic crisis. And Shell does not only control the extraction of oil, it also controls the distribution network. So even if Nigeria managed to take control of the extraction process, they would still need Shell to export it out of the country. With all this dependence, the Nigerian government found itself helpless, knowing that resisting this domination could leave its economy in shambles, causing civil unrest and revolt. But if the agreement was so bad for the country, why didn't Nigerian authorities try to prevent it? Remember what we mentioned at the beginning, that Nigeria was a very corrupt country? Well, it was thanks to a lot of bribery that Shell managed to make the government essentially a puppet for it. A recent anti-corruption investigation revealed that Shell transferred $1.3 billion to Nigeria that was supposed to be used for public policies. However, this money ended up in the pockets of several high-ranking government officials. And according to the investigation, Shell was already aware that this would happen. In return, without any objection, Shell gained access to the new oil field, OPL 245, which alone increased the company's oil reserves by 30%. This investigation is still ongoing, but if the corrupt government was enjoying all this abundance, the same cannot be said for the Nigerian population. When Shell signed the agreement with the Nigerian government, it committed to bringing investments and development to the country, creating jobs and income, and improving the lives of civilians. But what happened was a drastic worsening of the lives of the Nigerian population, all caused by what should bring wealth, oil. Since 2010, around 3,000 oil spills have been recorded, representing at least 29 million liters dumped into Nigeria's natural resources. All this oil ended up contaminating the main source of drinking water, making the water supply totally unfit for consumption and destroying the livelihoods of part of the population that relied on subsistence fishing and agriculture. In other words, instead of bringing wealth, Shell created even more poverty for those people who increasingly found themselves dependent on the alms that the company distributed. Moreover, as was predictable, Shell never took responsibility for all these oil spills. In fact, the company's claim is that all of this was due to constant oil theft and sabotage. Of the 29 million liters spilled, it took responsibility for only 151,000 liters. That is 0.5% of the total. With the government in its hands, it was very difficult for more serious investigations to be conducted. Additionally, Shell also bribed NGOs to turn a blind eye to what was happening and also focus on promoting the company. But the population began to react, and a large civil unrest began to unfold. People were tired of Shell's exploitation, the abusive use of their jobs, the impoverishment of their people, and the poisoning of their waters. People started to realize that they had been colonized, not by another nation, but by a single company. So, the Nigerian population began to protest. They wanted Shell to leave. They wanted these foreigners to stop siphoning their wealth and ruining their country. Demonstrations against the company became constant. Shell then launched its counterattack, taking advantage of all the power it had within the government, and also the armed forces. It managed to put the Nigerian army on the streets to combat these protests, and it was not done peacefully. The Nigerian army received generous bribes, and therefore, they had no shame in going against their own people. The use of excessive force was not a problem for them. To counter the protesters, firearms and grenades were used. In the end, the result was 80 people dead, and almost 600 houses were completely destroyed. And it doesn't end there. The Nigerian army was also accused of attacking women, looting properties, and torturing opponents. But none of this was enough to silence the people. And then, a man entered the scene, Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ogoniland is located in the Niger Delta, with a population of about 832,000 inhabitants, predominantly fishermen. Although its rivers were crucial for local subsistence, they have now become a source of harm since Shell began its operations in 1958. Ogoniland has become one of the most polluted places in the world. Studies showed that the levels of carcinogenic benzene in the water consumed by the Ogoni people were 900 times higher than allowed. However, this region alone generated over $30 billion for Shell's coffers. So Ken Saro-Wiwa, a Nigerian writer and environmental activist, founded the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, seeking to prevent Shell from further devastating the ecosystem of Ogoniland, all through nonviolent protests. This movement began to gain strength and bother all-powerful Shell, which feared losing the concession to extract oil from those productive lands. As a way to undermine the company even more, they began sabotaging Shell's infrastructure and intimidating company employees. This strategy worked, forcing Shell to suspend its operations in the Ogoniland region for a long time. Of course, the company's executives were furious, and together with the Nigerian government, they sought a way out of this. A few weeks after this meeting, on May 21, 1994, 4 local Ogoni leaders were brutally murdered by a crowd of young people. This was the chance. Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other leaders of the movement were tried under the pretext that the group had incited the murder of 4 Ogoni leaders. The most absurd thing is that Saro-Wiwa wasn't even in Ogoniland that day. The trial was widely discredited, with critics worldwide speaking out against the military regime of General Sani Abacha, who was then in power. Despite this, the 9 were found guilty. They remained imprisoned for over a year, until on October 1, 1995, the 9 were sentenced to death by hanging. Today, they are known as the Ogoni 9. To this day, the widows of the Ogoni 9 fight for justice. Obviously, in Nigeria, they were unable to win the case, as the government was complicit with Shell. So they filed lawsuits in other countries. Some witnesses were even heard, admitting that they were paid to lie about the murder of the 4 local leaders and thus incriminate Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues. Even so, the courts could not incriminate the company, and in 2009, Shell paid a paltry sum of $15.5 million to some of the activists' families, including Saro-Wiwa's family. A human rights group from Amnesty International, after studying thousands of internal Shell documents, found that the company encouraged the Nigerian army to combat the protests even knowing about all the abuses committed by the military. To this day, Shell denies any involvement in the executions. The Nigerian people continue to fight amid the rivers of oil that devastated their country. In this fight for environmental justice, The Agoni 9 lost their lives but also made it clear that the complicity of the fossil fuel industry in brutal human rights violations can no longer be denied. I hope you enjoyed our documentary. Leave your thoughts on this in the comments. Take the opportunity to watch the video where I talk about how ExxonMobil is currently doing the same with Guyana. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Big hug, and until the next video. Do you know which business model offers high profit margins, immense scalability, and requires low initial investment? The startup market specializing in software development is the optimal choice to bring together all these advantages. However, the only place where you will truly find a highly scalable service that demands low investment is with Roadmap. Roadmap has global experience providing consulting and developing apps for startups in the United States, Europe, and Latin America, making it by far the best option for new entrepreneurs. If you want to venture into the premier market, contact Roadmap right away through the website www.roadmap.co/home or via email at contact@roadmap.co.